One of the things we're going to be talking about tonight is this really incredible speech that you gave at the Oxford Union. It was a debate, and the debate was about a resolution that was this House believes that Israel is an apartheid state responsible for genocide. And you obviously argued for it, along with Oxford Union President Ibrahim Asman Mafawi, Palestinian poet and activist Mohammed El-Kurd, and anti-Zionist writer and activist Miko Peled. On the other side, arguing against this was UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust legal director Natasha Hausdorff, writer and Oxford alum Jonathan Sasser-Dodi, and former Palestinian spy and anti-Hamas activist Mossab Hassan Youssef, and Arab pro-Israel activist Yosef Haddad. So we are going to talk about this speech because for two reasons. One is I actually just wanted to have you on to talk about it because so many people were rightly hailing it as this really incredible speech, which it is. And then on top of that, obviously it was a powerful speech. And we know that because the Oxford Union uploaded the speech. And then after it got, I think, hundreds of thousands of views, took it down and removed only, I think, a total of like a few minutes of content. But I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at what they considered to be such dangerous content from you. So first up, we're going to show just the opening of your speech. And as people will see, it talks about, you know, some people who did not, I think, take the right lessons of persecution and trauma in terms of what they did to the people of Palestine. So let's take a look at your opening, and then we'll actually play the censored parts of it.
Before I start, I will not be taking any points of information, so kindly refrain from interrupting me. Addressing the challenge of what to do about the indigenous inhabitants of the land, Chaim Weizmann, a Russian Jew, said to the World Zionist Congress in 1921 that Palestinians were akin to, quote, the rocks of Judea, obstacles that had to be cleared on a difficult path. David Grun, a Polish Jew who changed his name to David Ben-Gurion in order to sound relevant to the region, said, quote, we must expel the Arabs and take their places. There are thousands of such conversations among the early Zionists who plotted and implemented the violent colonization of Palestine and the annihilation of her native people. But they were only partially successful, murdering or ethnically cleansing 80% of the Palestinians, which meant that 20% of us remained, an enduring obstacle to their colonial fantasies, which became the subject of their obsessions in the decades that followed, especially after conquering what remained of Palestine in 1967.
So that was your opening. Anything you want to say about that? Like how did it even occur to you to start there? I thought it was pretty fascinating. Oh, you're muted again.
So first of all, let me back up. When they invited me, the reason I decided to go was not really to debate people who, you know, I just don't really care to debate the people who think that we should be killed, or, you know, and I said this in part of my speech that talked about the humiliation of debating people who think our only life options should be to leave our homeland, submit to their supremacy, or die quietly and politely. But I decided to go because I have on multiple occasions gone back and listened to the speeches of Malcolm X and Jimmy Baldwin, who spoke at the Oxford Union and the Cambridge Union debates before I was born. And so the historic record mattered to me. And I wrote that speech for the historic record. It's not about you know, winning a debate or anything. I'm not a debater. I don't care what ultimately what any group of people decides in this moment. But the historic record is important because there will come a day in which future generations are going to study this extraordinary time when the whole world watched a live streamed genocide in the wholeness and the fullness of its gore and cruelty and mercilessness and horror. And we need to we should keep records of this moment for those who will come after us to study this. And so this was going to be, for me, part of the record. And so I worked a lot on this speech. Mostly the hard part about it was saying everything I wanted to say in less than 15 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, and so I worked on it for days, really, mostly to cut it down and to craft it in my voice, in my literary aesthetic, in my and craft it for content and for impact and for cadence and for all of these things. And I'm saying this really to underscore the offense of having the Oxford Union then go in and edit it.
Yeah. Right. And we're going to take a look at what they edited out. Now, it's interesting. They edited like a sentence here, a fragment there. So what we're going to do is we're going to show precisely what they edited out, and then we're going to show it in its like larger context so it makes more sense. So here is the first thing that they removed.
And in the 1980s, and 90s, Israeli soldiers had left booby-trapped toys in southern Lebanon that exploded when excited children picked them up.
Okay, so I mean, that is, I think it's probably self-explanatory why they wouldn't want that in there. But what are your thoughts on that? Why that was so threatening to them?
I think my whole speech was threatening to them, honestly. But regardless, that's documented.
Right.
It's documented in news reports at the time. It's documented in UN reports, in eyewitness testimony, in victim testimony. It's part of the historic record.
Right.
Of course, yeah, they don't want people to know that. I think if they could have, they would have, you know, just erased my entire speech.
Right. Yeah. Did they suggest beforehand that they had the right to like edit anything out? Did they ever say that? I'm just curious.
The Oxford Union?
Yeah.
So it's interesting because I had a writer. That they agreed to that my speech would not be edited at all.
Oh, you had a writer. Oh, okay. I thought you were saying writer. Okay, writer.
Oh,
Got it. Yeah.
a writer, RIDER.
Wow.
However, the release that they told me I had to sign because because it was, which I was told was a formality, and that the writer that they had agreed to would trump everything else. But that release said, sort of gave them the right to edit it for, I think, just aesthetic, to sort of excise one speech. There's certainly no indication anywhere that they, nor is there a precedent actually that they would edit like my words. I mean, it's kind of, to me, especially because I wasn't speaking off the cuff. All the other speakers sort of maybe had notes or something. If they were speaking off the cuffs, they're orators and that's what they do. But I'm a writer and that's what I do. And I read what I wrote because I like I said, I weighed every sentence. It was a crafted speech. Yeah. And so for them to go in and edit that is kind of like somebody taking my books and editing some of my words and then just publishing it without, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, as without even acknowledging it, right? Like it's not even like this has been edited for length or whatever, like people will sometimes do. Yeah.
Well, that's another thing too, because so first of all, there's this sort of infringement on my intellectual property, my intellectual labor. But then also there's the offense against the historic record. Like they've fashioned these people who claim to be bastions of free speech and open debate, in fact, made themselves the arbiters of what's acceptable speech and what's not. So that's the other thing. But yeah, I mean, it was just it's just egregious. It was just egregious all around.
So let's actually watch again, because your words are so powerful. Let's watch the context of that booby trap toy clip so people can hear, the context.
When I was in Gaza this year, I saw a little boy no more than 9 years whose hands and part of his face had been blown off by a booby-trapped can of food that soldiers had left behind for Gaza's starving children. I later learned that they also had left poisoned food for people in Shujaiya. That's bullshit. And in the 1980s, and 90s, Israeli soldiers had left booby-trapped toys in southern Lebanon that exploded when excited children picked them up.
So they respond, they can't, they say that's bullshit, right? In this hall of, intellectual decorum. That's how they respond to your claim, which is true. And then, I mean, it makes sense that people would want that part about, I mean, everything that you're describing is awful, but I think there's something particularly diabolical about booby trapping toys. Because it's so targeting children. Oh, you're muted again. You're preemptively muted because you're so used to being silenced, right?
No, yeah, you're right, because it's literally intended for children. So why else would you booby trap toys?
Yeah. Another level of horror. As is Israel not letting in anesthesia as a record number, a record ratio, record percentage of children are undergoing amputations.
And a lot of people, you can die from shock too. And so the pain can be so severe that it sends you into a fatal shock. And that's happened to a lot of people who just, one of the most intense physical pains you can feel is bone pain, sawing through bones. That is, that's barbaric. That's off the scales pain, and children were going through that, if you can imagine.
No, it's truly unimaginable. Sadism. Yeah. Well, back to your powerful words. Let's take a look at another censored piece of your speech, and then again we'll play the longer clip for context. But this is not surprising at all that it got censored. Let's take a look.
If Palestinians were systematically raping Jewish doctors, patients, and other captives with hot metal rods, jagged and electrified sticks, and fire extinguishers, sometimes raping them to death, as happened with Dr. Adnan al-Bursh and others.
So that, yeah.
But it's true.
Right, I know, yeah. It's true.
Yeah.
Which is why, of course, they can't have you say it. And, we've talked about this a lot on the show, how, God forbid anyone who talks about the mass rape, I put that in quotes, the October 7th mass rape. It would be one thing if they talked about that and then also talked about the documented rape of Palestinians. I could think that they were gullible as opposed to outright lying, but they are outright lying, because there's no way that Jake Tapper and Dana Bash don't know about the rape, because it's not covered by the New York Times. And, in other words, it's not just Electronic Intifada or Mondo Weiss or the Gray Zone. It's covered by now the New York Times. It's covered by all Israeli media. And as everyone knows who pays attention to this, you have a Knesset member saying it's legitimate. It's not denied by Israel. So anyone who claims to talk about anyone who claims to care about sexual violence, who ignores that, obviously just could not care less about it.
Right.
So,
right. They all kind of went on this whole media blitz of believe Israeli women, etc. Except, but don't believe Palestinian women. Don't believe Palestinian men.
Right.
Don't even believe Israeli rapists who admit to raping. Right. Don't believe it. or
Right. Don't
ignoring.
believe
Yeah.
Israelis protesting because they're angry at Israeli police for detaining Israeli soldiers for rape.
I think that's kind of an unprecedented
Yeah.
thing in history. I don't think anybody has ever rioted or protested because they felt they had the right to systematically rape
Yeah.
another people.
Yeah, it truly is. I mean, it's almost like if I heard about it in a script, I would say it's like over the top.
Yeah.
Like if it was in a
Well,
screenplay, right?
it's hard
Like
to
no one
imagine.
will believe that. That's too much. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is. Yeah. So let's take a look at this because this is a very effective part of your speech where you're basically just calling out the stunning hypocrisy and double standards. So let's take a look at the clip that this comes from.
It is clear to me that we are not here to debate whether Israel is an apartheid or genocidal state. This debate is ultimately about the worth of Palestinian lives. It's about the worth of our schools, our research centers, our books, our art. It's about the worth of the homes we worked all our lives to build and which contain memories of generations. It's about the worth of our humanity and our agency, of our bodies and our ambitions. Because if the roles were reversed, if Palestinians had spent the last 8 decades stealing Jewish homes, expelling, oppressing, imprisoning, poisoning, torturing, killing, raping them, if Palestinians had killed an estimated 300,000 Jews in 1 year, targeted their journalists, their thinkers, their healthcare workers, their athletes, their artists, bombed every Israeli hospital, university, library, museum, cultural center, synagogue, and simultaneously set up an observation platform where citizens came to watch their slaughter as if a tourist attraction. If Palestinians had corralled them by the hundreds of thousands into flimsy tents, bombed them in so-called safe zones, burned them alive, cut off their food and water and medicine. If Palestinians made their children wander barefoot with empty pots, made them gather the flesh of their parents into plastic bags, bury their siblings, their cousins, their friends, made them sneak out from their tents at night to sleep on their parents' graves, made them pray for death, just to join their families and not be alone in this terrible world. If we terrorize them so utterly that their children lose their hair, lose their memory, lose their minds, and made those as young as 4 and 5 die of heart attacks, if we mercilessly force their NICU babies to die, alone in hospital beds, crying until they could cry no more, died and decomposed in the same spot. If Palestinians used wheat flour, a truck, to lure starving Jews, then opened fire on them as they gathered to collect the day's bread. If Palestinians finally allowed a food delivery into a shelter with hungry Jews, then set fire to the entire shelter and aid truck before anyone could taste a bite of the food. If a Palestinian sniper bragged about blowing out 42 Jewish kneecaps in one day, as one Israeli soldier did in 2019, if a Palestinian admitted to CNN that he ran over hundreds of Jews with his tank, their squished flesh lingering in the tank treads, if Palestinians were systematically raping Jewish doctors, patients, and other captives with hot metal rods, jagged and electrified sticks, and fire extinguishers, sometimes raping them to death, as happened with Dr. Adnan al-Bursh and others. If Jewish women were forced to give birth in filth, get C-sections or leg amputations without anesthesia, if we destroyed their children, then decorated our tanks with their toys, if we killed or displaced their women then posed in their lingerie. If the world were watching the live-streamed systematic annihilation of Jews in real time, there would be no debating whether that constituted terrorism or genocide.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like the people, like going back to what I had said earlier in our conversation, this really does to me like bring out, it's such a moral line in the sand, because if you see that and hear about that, I guess I'm saying this as a Jew, but like to my fellow Jews, if you hear that or see that and think that, well, that has to happen, as opposed to, we can't do that. How can we possibly do that to other people when that kind of stuff was done to us? It's like I just think have no soul. And also, I think you probably would have been a Nazi if you could have been during that time,
Well,
or a Nazi sympathizer.
I mean, that's the behavior.
Yeah.
That's the behavior they're exhibiting.
Now, Vladimir Putin and Andrei Belousov met with the entirety of the defense ministry on December 16th, and Putin had this to say, and I wanted to play this before I get your comments. So he talked about pushing red lines, and here is his warning. I'm just going to play about a minute of this.
We see that the current administration of the United States and practically the entire collective West do not abandon their attempts to maintain their global dominance. They continue to impose their so-called rules on the world community, which they change time and again, distorting them as it suits them. Well, strictly speaking, they have only one stable rule: no rules for those who do this. For those who consider themselves at the head of the whole world, for those who consider themselves representatives of God on earth, although they themselves do not fear God. And against unwanted states they wage hybrid wars, implement a policy of containment, including with respect to Russia, in an effort to weaken our country, to inflict a strategic defeat on us. The United States continues to pump the de facto illegitimate ruling regime in Kiev with weapons and money. They send mercenaries and military advisors, and thus they encourage further escalation of the conflict. At the same time, under the pretext of a mythical Russian threat, they simply frighten their population by saying that we are going to attack someone, because their tactics are very simple. They bring us to the red line, across which we can no longer retreat. We begin to respond to them, and they immediately frighten their population with the former Soviet, and now Russian, threat.
So, Ben, I wanted to play that because at the same time that they were meeting with the defense ministry, Vladimir Putin and Andrei Belousov, talking about preparing for war with NATO and pushing red lines, we had this attack. So your thoughts and your comments on where this attack fits into this broader, it seems like, build-up and escalation that we've been seeing entering into Trump 2.0.
Yeah, well, it's more of the same. I mean, it's clear that Ukraine has lost this war, and as they have lost, they've become more and more desperate and have engaged in these kinds of attacks where they're just killing top-level officials in Russia. And of course, if Ukraine did this, it was with the support of they said that they did this. And when they do these kinds of things, they do so with the support of the United States. Ukraine does not make these kinds of important decisions without getting approval from Washington. We've seen this again and again, where every month or two, they keep moving further and further up the escalation ladder, and they have to ask for approval from the White House. And so, for instance, before this, the latest escalation was that Ukraine is now using long-range missiles that were provided by the US in order to strike deep into Russian territory. But again, I mean, they've lost this war. If you read mainstream Western media outlets, they're finally acknowledging that Ukraine, that is NATO, has lost. So before it's inevitable that this war has to come to an end, they continue to kill Russian officials, trying to pressure Russia to essentially give them what NATO wants, which Russia is not going to accept. I mean, we can hear that very clearly in Putin's speech there. And that's an important speech also because he's putting the context of the war in a much larger overall situation, which is not just about Ukraine. It's about the US-led West truly thinks that it rules the entire world. They talk about their so-called rules-based international order in which they make the rules. They order everyone around. As he said, they think that they're the gods of the world. When he said those comments, it reminded me of American exceptionalism and how every US president says, we are the greatest country in history ever created. I mean, that is a kind of religious view that we are the best thing ever in human history and no one can be better than us. And that is such a common view. In fact, if you're a politician in the US and you don't say that, you're attacked as a traitor because you're not this extreme supremacist, I mean, who sees yourself truly as the God on earth. So I personally, I know that there are a lot of people who always like to say, oh, there's so much more escalation, it's going to be World War III. And I actually don't think at that point. I think there were several moments in the past 2 years that were very dangerous. And fortunately, we did not go into World War III, which would be disastrous. I think ultimately these are signs of Ukrainian desperation and by extension, NATO desperation.
NATO's strategic concept in 2022, at the height of the Ukraine conflict at the July summit, they say the People's Republic of China's stated ambitions and course of policies challenge our interest, security, and values. The People's Republic of China employs a broad range of political, economic, and military tools to increase its global footprint and project its power. While opaque about its strategy, it has intentions of military buildup. The deepening of strategic partnership between the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation and their mutually reinforcing attempts to undercut the rules-based international order run counter to our interests. That's a direct quote from the strategic concept. And it was noted at that time, Ben, and this hasn't changed, that this was the first time that NATO itself looked at the Pacific and said, we are going to put this as our priority.
Yeah, and that was, as you mentioned, that was the height of the Ukraine proxy war 2 years ago. NATO's rhetoric against China has become even more aggressive in the past 2 years. And now South Korea and Japan, very much not in the North Atlantic, are participating in NATO meetings, including recently the defense ministers of NATO who get together for a meeting every year. The defense ministers of South Korea and Japan also participated. So NATO is expanding into the Pacific because, again, they see China as their main so-called threat. And when they say threat, they mean a country that is actually powerful enough to challenge what Putin talked about earlier as the Western-led dictatorship in the world, which is that the West sees itself as gods. They think that they can control the entire world, that everyone must obey them. They can sanction and wage economic war against any country they don't like and try to destroy their economy, as they did to Syria, as they've tried to do for 60 years against Cuba. And now that's why they want to destroy China, to prevent the global South from actually having an alternative.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And that is the overall project, isn't it, Ben, to ensure that the world does not have an alternative to the United States empire. And that's why it's so interesting. I think we have in terms of how the coverage is. It's Ukraine conflict is happening. China, sometimes there's news about Taiwan, but China is kind of in the background, only some commentary sometimes from these warmongers. And of course, the Middle East being so much in crisis, and there's so much going on there, which we're about to move on to. But it appears that this project, Project Ukraine, some people call it, but really it is the project to topple Russia. It really is not just a project against Russia. It is a global project to maintain dominance and hegemony.
That's absolutely right. It's a project to isolate China. Again, I mean, I'm not saying that it's not about Russia. Obviously, it's about Russia as well. But ultimately, why is Russia seen as a so-called threat to the West? It's because Russia has politically and economically integrated with Asia, specifically with China, and because Russia refused to integrate into the West on unequal footing, being a subservient part of the US-led West. And that is why Russia is seen as such a threat. Go back to the 1990s, read Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the leading US imperial strategist. He was previously the US National Security Advisor, who helped oversee the famous bear trap in Afghanistan of supporting the Mujahideen, who became the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, in order to wage a proxy war against the Soviet Union. Well, Brzezinski, in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, he famously said that the biggest threat to US dominance would be what he called an anti-hegemonic alliance of China, Russia, and Iran. Well, here we are. China, Russia, and Iran are close partners. So all of these conflicts are about isolating China, weakening China, and eventually trying to overthrow the Chinese government. Obviously, they would like to overthrow Putin. They would like to overthrow the Russian government and install another Boris Yeltsin. There's no doubt. In fact, Biden said that very openly at the beginning of this new phase of the Ukraine proxy war. He gave a speech in Poland, and he said that. But why are they so concerned? Specifically, it's about isolating China. This is also what Syria is about. I mean, it's not the only thing. Again, no conflict is about one specific issue. It's not just about China. It's not just about a pipeline. It's not just about all the whatever, Israel. It's about a multiplicity of factors. But one of the most important of those factors is trying to decapitate all of the partners of China, which is the most powerful country challenging US-led Western dominance.
But I wanted to ask you, Ben, about this overall situation in Syria. We have Israel expanding into Syria, I believe, to a proportion of the size of 3 times that of Gaza now it occupies. We also have Turkey readying an invasion, and we also have a letter from Bashar al-Assad. At least it has been verified by some. There's still some questions about its authenticity, but in it, Bashar al-Assad claims that he was at the Russian air base, that he was there until the end, and he says that at the Hmeimim air base, that there was drone attacks on that air base, which led to actually an evacuation of everybody, Russian personnel and himself, which is what led to his ultimate arrival in Moscow. Ben, help us understand what's going on in Syria and where things are going.
Yeah, well, assuming this letter is real, I mean, it has been reported as the statements by Assad. We don't have 100% certainty on that, but it was a short statement. He said that he did not plan on stepping down, that he went to Latakia, to this air base, and that he was also corresponding with the Russian military, trying to bomb these extremist groups. And then they attacked the air base in Latakia on the coast in the west of Syria. And there are a few things that come to mind. First of all, we should keep in mind that the so-called rebels, which were led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is rebranded Al-Qaeda, HTS. This group was previously Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the Syrian Al-Qaeda affiliate. It was the largest Al-Qaeda affiliate on earth. And then they rebranded, and hilariously, the US government, which has been allied with Al-Qaeda in Syria for a decade, as was admitted by the current US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, back in 2012, when he was the top aide to Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State in the Obama administration. He published an email to her in which he said, quote, AQ is on our side in Syria, end quote. AQ is, of course, Al-Qaeda. So acknowledging that the US has been allied with Al-Qaeda for a decade. And there have been many reports in mainstream media that Al-Qaeda in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, was using US weapons. The Pentagon itself admitted that some of these so-called moderate rebels who were trained by the Pentagon and also by the CIA, which spent $1 billion a year training and arming these so-called rebels in what was the largest CIA covert operation since Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan in the 1980s that gave birth to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The Pentagon admitted that some of those so-called moderate rebels then joined Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So the point is that the U.S. has been allied with Al-Qaeda in Syria for a decade. Don't take my word on it. That's what Jake Sullivan said. And so the US was supporting these groups. But ironically, when Jabhat al-Nusra rebranded as HTS, the US State Department said that they did not recognize that this group is independent of al-Qaeda. They said this is just a name change. They still recognize it as a terrorist organization, as al-Qaeda. And now this group, rebranded al-Qaeda, is the de facto ruler of Syria. They were the ones who took over. And the point I was going to get at earlier is that when they were taking over Syria and attacking, this is not some ragtag group of guerrilla fighters. They were very heavily armed, well-trained with advanced technology. They had many tanks and they had advanced drones, including the so-called kamikaze drones that have been used in Ukraine. And there are reports that in addition to getting support, of course, from the West, from Turkey, from Israel, they also got support from Ukraine. So once again, I mean, all these wars are not only politically linked, they are in many cases militarily linked. And there have been reports that the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces have been helping to support these al-Qaeda linked rebels in Syria. The Ukrainian military, Ukrainian intelligence have been supporting these al-Qaeda linked rebels. And the Ukraine reportedly also gave some of these kamikaze drones to these al-Qaeda linked rebels. Also Turkey, a member of NATO, who always plays both sides and no one can ever trust them. Turkey has for years been giving these drones to Ukraine in order to fight against Russia. And of course, Turkey has been giving drones to these al-Qaeda linked rebels in Syria. So as for Assad's statement, I think it's very realistic. If he says that they were in this airbase that was attacked by drones, well, these so-called rebels were getting the support of many foreign countries. They had kamikaze drones. They had military capabilities. Again, this is not just a ragtag group of Syrians who just decided to pick up weapons and then just fight against Assad. I mean, they clearly are backed by multiple foreign powers. And now that they're in power, we can see that clearly. The US government has made it very clear. The deputy of the National Security Council for the White House said that the US is not leaving. The US has had troops in Syria for nearly a decade. They are occupying 1/3 of Syrian territory in the east, which just so happened to be the oil-rich territory. There are videos of US armored vehicles with the US flag patrolling around the oil fields in Syria. They were using this to starve the Syrian government of revenue that caused a hyperinflation crisis, along with the suffocating sanctions on Syria that successfully collapsed the Syrian economy and collapsed the state. So the US is occupying the eastern part of Syria. Israel is now colonizing more and more Syrian territory. Israel has already illegally held the Golan Heights since 1967 in violation of international law. Now it has expanded further. Israeli colonial occupier troops are now 20 kilometers from the capital, Damascus. Netanyahu has said he has no intention of leaving. So just as Israel is colonizing northern Gaza, it's colonizing southern Lebanon, now it's colonizing western Syria. And then you have Turkey. Turkey is also colonizing the northern part of Syria. So you have the US colonizing East Syria. You have Turkey, a member of NATO, colonizing North Syria. You have Israel colonizing Western Syria. You also have the US military at the Atanf base on the border in near the southeast, also near Iraq. So, I mean, this is a country whose sovereignty has been completely violated. It's being treated like a colony. It reminds me of the Sykes-Picot Agreement during World War II, in which the British and French empires, along with the Ottoman Empire and the Tsarist Russian Empire, they carved up West Asia and said, we're going to get each little territory. It reminds me of what the Western powers are now doing to Syria today. And then they have their little al-Qaeda linked puppets in power in Damascus. And you have Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who's now rebranded as Ahmad al-Shara. And he's saying, we want no conflict with Israel. We want peace with Israel, not saying a single word for the Palestinian people while Israel is bombing Gaza, not saying anything. And in fact, these al-Qaeda rebranded rebels are saying our real adversary is Iran. We want to help the US and Israel fight Iran. And we want to, of course, support these groups that are fighting against China. These extremists And, there's all this propaganda in the West saying that China was lying about the extremists in Xinjiang and that it's all fake. Well, meanwhile, here we have these extremists who are affiliated with Al-Qaeda from the so-called Turkestan Islamic Party, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate. And they're saying, yeah, we're going to try to wage war against China. How convenient. I'm sure it's a coincidence that the US government has spent decades supporting these groups, trying to break up China, trying to wage war in China. And they just so happen to now have a base of operations in Syria. Obviously, it's not a coincidence.
We know that this is a blow again, but the instability is going to also factor into that situation, which is, I think, true from across the region, that this has been a real big plague that the United States and its imperial allies have spread across the region, and people don't like it. And so we're still going to see resistance, and that is going to, I think, also play a factor. But indeed, we do see a big retreat. Any final comments on this? I do want to get one more, maybe a short commentary on something Trump said about China. But any final comments on this, Ben?
Yeah, the axis of resistance has been dealt a blow, a significant blow, but it is not defeated. As the adage goes, the axis of resistance lost this battle, but they have not lost the war. So a few thoughts. First of all, the axis of resistance has actually grown, even though it has lost Syria. Yemen, Ansar Allah, known as the Houthis, but that's the derogatory term. They're called Ansar Allah. They control the majority of Yemen, where the majority of the population lives, including the capital, Sana'a. They're not just like a small little group. They have created a state apparatus with elements of the former Yemeni government. And they have created a kind of revolution that they call the September 21st revolution, I believe. And which is when they launched their original uprising against a US-backed puppet dictator in Yemen. And they have created a government, and they have good relations with Iran. They had good relations with Syria. They also, by the way, have good relations with Venezuela, with Cuba, with Nicaragua. I mean, they've built this kind of, with Russia, like they've kind of built this international de facto alliance, even though they're not officially recognized as the UN recognized government in Yemen. So it's interesting. I mean, what happened in Yemen, that's a new addition to the axis of resistance that didn't exist a decade ago, really. And what's also interesting is that they have been supporting Palestine. They don't have to do that. They've, to much personal sacrifice, the Yemeni government, the de facto government in the north, which is where the majority of the Yemenis live, they have tried to put a kind of naval blockade on Israel to try to stop the genocide in Gaza. And they've had some success, at least in causing ships to reroute, which has also done severe damage to the Israeli economy. So that's an addition. So yeah, it is, of course, a major loss in Syria, but that's why I wanted to emphasize that, well, one country has been lost, another country has been added. Furthermore, in Lebanon, okay, yes, Israel has decapitated the leadership of Hezbollah, but Hezbollah was not defeated. In fact, the fact that Israel was forced to sign this so-called ceasefire, which was not a ceasefire, was fake, but because immediately the week after Israel signed the so-called ceasefire, it bombed Lebanon 100 times, according to the UN. It's not a ceasefire. But the fact that Israel even signed it was a recognition that it was not able to defeat Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which is a huge development compared to the 1980s, for instance. The reason that Hezbollah was even created is because Israel invaded South Lebanon and occupied it and was trying to colonize South Lebanon. Hezbollah was created as the indigenous Lebanese resistance against Israeli colonialism. And in 2006, when Israel invaded another time, they defeated Israel. But even in 2006, Israel was able to take much more Lebanese territory and eventually bomb the hell out of Beirut and try to take Beirut unsuccessfully. The point is that despite the fact that Hezbollah's leadership has been decapitated, they're still even stronger today than they were 20 years ago. Yeah. So Hezbollah is not going anywhere. So Hezbollah has not been defeated. Hamas in Gaza has not been defeated, despite the fact that Israel has just completely destroyed northern Gaza. I mean, they are, of course, ethnically cleansing the north in order to colonize the north. They've made that very clear. They're not hiding that. So they can try to take more territory, but they have not defeated Hamas, which is a group that did not have nearly as much access to weapons and military technology that Hezbollah has had, because Gaza is so geographically isolated and it just completely blockaded by Israel. So Israel has not defeated Hamas. They have not defeated Hezbollah. Iran is, of course, still intact with a very powerful military. Yemen is now part of the resistance axis. Iraq has multiple resistance groups that have been involved in actually launching strikes against Israel and its allies. So yes, they did succeed in helping to overthrow the Syrian government. That is a major blow. We should not, beat around the bush. It's a major blow. But again, there still are many other parts of the resistance that are active. And finally, although it's very bad for the Syrian people, the fact that Syria is going to remain in this state of chaos and internal conflict and civil war like Libya, that also means that because there's going to be territory in Syria that's basically not under central control, it's going to be a bunch of warlords vying for power. It also makes it possible to continue sending weapons through Syria into Lebanon and potentially Palestine. So that was one of the reasons that Syria was an important part of the resistance axis, is because even though Syria was not directly waging war against Israel because they were afraid of the consequences of sanctions and war, and we saw what happened to them. Their state was destroyed through all of that. They allowed Iran to send weapons through Iraq, through Syria, into Lebanon, into Palestine. And the fact that Syria is now going to be in the state of chaos means that those weapons can probably still be sent. So again, we should be realistic that this is a blow, but we should not be this. I've seen too much defeatism. People saying this is the end of the resistance axis and Palestine is doomed. No, as long as there is oppression and Israel is more and more oppressive, more and more overtly fascist, run by these maniacs who are calling openly for genocide. The finance minister who said that we should starve all 2 million Palestinians in Gaza to death, but unfortunately the international community won't let us. That's what he said, Smotrich. I mean, these people are fascist maniacs. The more and more extreme they get, the more and more they only create more domestic resistance in Palestine, in Lebanon. So yeah, I mean, the loss of Syria is a loss, but until the oppression ends, the resistance will always continue.
Yes, indeed. And yeah, Syria, a lot of people are talking about it. Syria was a real, for all of whatever errors I've seen people make. I've been disappointed in a lot of the responses to Syria because, like you, Ben, we've both been talking about this war as a regime change war. And, Syria did have this value to it, to the axis of resistance, as one of the last Arab countries, or at least Arab-led countries, diverse country, to, hold up the mantle of independence and national liberation. And it did play that central role. And so, I've seen a lot of people making criticisms about Syria's decision-making in the recent years, even claiming that it was against the axis of resistance. And I haven't bought that one bit, that it didn't want to send weapons, advanced weapons it was holding for Hezbollah to Hezbollah. It was, at a critical juncture when Hezbollah opened up a front, Syria didn't want to open a front, completely negating the fact that Syria was indeed not in any position to fight an open war with Israel. And now we see that, it actually wasn't at all in a position to do that come 2023.
It was literally fighting for survival. I mean,
exactly.
And one quick point. I know you wanted to continue, sorry, but just on this idea that Syria abandoned the resistance axis. In fact, the reason that the Syrian government fell is because it did not abandon the resistance axis, period. We have reports from Reuters that say that the U.S. was using the UAE as their negotiator to pressure Syria, and saying that in return for lifting the illegal sanctions and economic blockade they imposed on Syria in violation of international law, Syria would have to end support for Hezbollah and it would have to cut ties with Iran. The fact that Syria refused to do that is why the government fell. Period.
It's time that the macho, patriarchal society that trivializes rape changes. It's time we change the way we look at rape. I have faith in our capacity to collectively hold of a future in which everybody, women, men, can live together in harmony, respect, and mutual understanding. Helena, how do you feel reading or hearing these details, particularly, as a woman?
I mean, it should be more shocking to me, but knowing, it's interesting being as somebody who transitioned person, I'm transgender, for people who aren't aware, in case you weren't, knowing the kind of things that I could hear, the kind of attitudes that I heard about women within friend groups, or not friend groups necessarily, but amongst men. I went to an all-boys school before I transitioned. I'm hearing the kind of ways in which men broadly throughout my life that I've known have spoken about women, and the ways in which these attitudes about women are pervasive throughout society. It should be more shocking than it already is, right? But it's clear, once you've had the lived experience as women, you've experienced, you've felt the shame that is placed upon women across society for the ways in which the men act towards us, the way we are made to feel shame in the way that men especially act towards women in society. It's a part of the fabric. It's part of the fabric of patriarchal society to try and make women feel ashamed about the way that men act towards us. And the strongest thing that Giselle Pellico talked about throughout the entirety of this ordeal, throughout the publicization of all of this ideal, is the narrative of anti-shame, of being essentially proud to take these people to court, to take this, obviously Dominique Pellico himself and the men that he corralled together to commit these unspeakable acts, and to proudly stand against it and not feel shame, and to say and to show the strength that the world needs her to show in the face of what we've seen over the years in which these attacks were carried out. And that is one thing that I've really taken away from the strength of the feeling that she has, that she will not be allowed to be shamed by the ordeal that she went through. And she will show the personal strength to be able to be the figurehead for a movement to try and get these things out of our this toxin out of our society forever. Now, one thing also as well, it's really important to understand about rape and sexual assault is that the central theme of it is power, right? It's the power that Dominique Pellico had over his wife at the time, that he showed against her, or that he weaponized against her, to be able to, with that era of trust, the trust that they had to then commit these unspeakable crimes as well. Now, we always try and associate the fact that rape is about power to the powerful. We talk about the figures, the figureheads within the media with people that we've known, the famous figures that have committed these kind of acts. When, as you've quite rightly pointed out in your piece, the vast majority of these cases happen when the attacker is known to the victim. And of course, this was orchestrated by the most intimate of relations to Giselle Pellico in her husband, which is what makes it so terrifying to live as a woman in society, knowing that it could be anybody. Of course, it isn't all men, it never is, but it's enough that there is it never goes away. The threat of what could theoretically happen from people that you know in your own life, up to the point where we see something horrific like the acts that were described throughout the ordeal that Giselle Pellico went through. Also, speaking about the backgrounds of the people who came into this, the people who were party to these attacks, the 50 men who were also put through the legal process, is that it really puts paid to my especially my own personal class reductionism. And it doesn't matter what sector of society that you come from, it doesn't matter what class you belong to, it doesn't matter what race you are, you always, as a woman existing in society, will be subjected to the kind of patriarchal abuses that have been part of society, no matter where you are in the world, no matter whatever time that you've existed throughout the world, throughout human history. And the fight to try and end these things has been a long one, and it is continuing every single day, and and if we ever stop, we will see the kind of resurgence of online misogyny that we've seen as well from the people like Andrew Tate of this world. It's especially galling knowing how many men went through this Not a single one. Not a single one went to the authorities. Not a single one felt an own sense of personal shame of knowing these things were going on and would not report it to the relevant authorities to get these people brought to justice sooner and to stop the attacks from happening anymore. They all went through it. They all were contacted, even people who said no, and no one thought to alert the authorities or Giselle herself at any point throughout what went on. It took the heroic, I say heroic, but what should be the normal actions, of a supermarket employee who didn't even catch him doing something that was part of what we know happened to Giselle, this upskirting incident in a supermarket, and reported this to the police. It was only that's very specific. It's that one man who showed I say bravery, but I said it should be normalized, who showed the correct behavior, which is to report what he'd seen to the authorities. It took that far, having upskirted for years as well, which Mr. Pelligo had done. And that shows you just how far the rot sets in, that it can take this much time, this many people can know, before we even get to the point at which that it had been reported so that these things could stop. That's how far the vow of silence goes. And one thing I would like to end this on, bringing it back to the UK, in that in our legal process, because the standard is so high to be able to get proof for any kind of conviction, rape has become de facto legal in our society. I remember there was a time, it was the Prime Minister's questions, Rishi Sunak was talking about, he was bragging about, under the Conservative government, rape prosecutions have doubled. Yeah, they doubled from 1.6 to 3.2%. That's how easy it is to get away with these things. And without a robust legal system, without a robust network of people able and understanding that you cannot continue this vow of silence amongst the patriarchal nature of society. You cannot continue this vow of silence without reporting what you understand and what you should know is wrong. These stats will remain as low as they are. And without the legal oversight to be able to stop these things happening before, they will only continue. And we need to show that fight to continue what Giselle has started.
Yeah, I mean, what is extraordinary about this case is not that a woman experienced sexual violence at the hands of her husband. What's extraordinary is, like you said, Helena, her refusal of shame and the fact that she made sure that her violators were put on public trial. And, of course, I'm sure that was incredibly traumatizing. And I think that it's, as a woman, like watching these kinds of stories, it's always very difficult because on the one hand, we want to communicate the ordinariness of this and how, like you said, those low-grade objectifications of women that happen in everyday culture that is embedded in our media, is embedded the way that media talks about women, is embedded in so-called locker room talk, that this is an ordinary and ubiquitous part of our culture. But I also don't want to live my life in like constant fear. Like I don't want that to be the defining subjectivity of a woman's life, is to just be in fear of the men who are close to her. But when you see these kinds of statistics, it becomes very difficult to navigate. And as I said, what strikes me here is that we're not just talking about this is not just the perversion of this one man or these 50 men. There were thousands of men who were on these forums that were notorious for engaging in graphic descriptions and sometimes even organizing sexually violent encounters. And yet there are thousands more men who follow these quasi-cult leaders who traffic in this misogyny, and Andrew Tate is one of them, that also exist amongst us. And what I would say, if anyone watching here also happens to be a follower of Andrew Tate or any of these other patriarchal demagogues who are engaging in this cultural backlash against the meager gains that the feminist movement has made in recognition of gender-based violence, I understand that this world is chaotic and violent, and you might be gravitating towards ideologies that promise you that dominating others will help you feel a sense of order and power within that chaos and violence. But so long as your sense of self-empowerment relies on treating other human beings as objects, on dehumanizing other people, on hierarchizing the value of life, you will never be free of the demons that haunt you. And that's all I have to say on that. Next story is also a heavy one, a warning that this contains distressing themes along the lines of violence as well. So please exercise discretion when listening. Médecins Sans Frontières has released a new report on the conditions that Israel is inflicting on Palestinians in Gaza. Describing Gaza as a death trap, MSF goes on to detail what it calls Israel's campaign of total destruction in the enclave. The report is based on data collected between October 2023 and October 2024, including extensive interviews with MSF staff who have been working in the Strip through the war. For many of those staff members, continuing to work in Gaza has come at a very high cost, with the report saying this. Over the first 12 months of hostilities, MSF staff themselves have endured 41 attacks and violent incidents, including airstrikes, shelling, and violent incursions in health facilities, direct fire on its shelters, and convoys and arbitrary detention by Israeli forces. 8 MSF colleagues and many of their family members have been killed, many more have been injured. Medical personnel and patients alike have been forced to urgently evacuate health facilities on 17 separate occasions, often literally running for their lives. MSF has only been able to restart activities in 3 facilities. Based on MSF operational data, as well as staff testimonies, the report concludes with this. In the north of the Strip in particular, the recent military offensive is a clear illustration of the brutal war the Israeli forces are waging on Gaza, and we are witnessing clear signs of ethnic cleansing as Palestinian life is being wiped off the area. Our first-hand observations of the medical and humanitarian catastrophe inflicted on Gaza are consistent with the descriptions provided by an increasing number of legal experts and organizations, concluding that genocide is taking place in Gaza. While we don't have the legal authority to establish intentionality, the signs of ethnic cleansing and the ongoing devastation, including mass killings, severe physical and mental health injuries, forced displacement, and impossible conditions of life for Palestinians under siege and bombardment, are undeniable. Attacks on civilians, the dismantling of the healthcare system, the deprivation of food, water, and supplies are a form of collective punishment inflicted by the Israeli authorities on the people of Gaza. Now, one area that MSF is naturally interested in is the destruction of the healthcare system in Gaza. The report meticulously details the siege of Nasser Hospital at the beginning of this year. 850 patients alongside thousands of refugees were trapped in the hospital for weeks, and when people tried to leave, they encountered Israeli sniper fire. Then, in February, the hospital was bombed. The hospital was then raided by the IDF, with one patient describing his treatment at the hands of Israeli soldiers like this. They had done surgery to insert a metal plate in my body due to shrapnel injuries in my back and abdomen. By the end of February, the Israeli tanks reached Nasser Hospital. After 2 days of warnings to evacuate, they raided the hospital. I was captured, tortured, and interrogated. There were inspections and interrogations, with beatings, of course. They targeted young men with beards. They would mark people with an X. An X on the forehead meant field interrogation plus interrogation in a place where they would take us. An X on the knee meant field interrogation only. One of their torture methods was to pull out any metal plates one had in their body. I can never forget the sight of them ripping the metal plate out of someone's body. It seared into my memory. Of course, the destruction of Gaza's healthcare system is not a thing of the past, rather it's ongoing and constant. Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza has come under repeated attack by the Israeli military, and on Tuesday night it was shelled once more, leaving its intensive care unit in flames. According to the hospital's medical director, at least 50 patients were injured in the onslaught. And just 2 weeks ago, the head of the hospital's intensive care unit, Dr. Ahmed Al-Kalout, was killed by an Israeli drone, reportedly while he was entering the medical center. By June this year, just 9 months into Israel's relentless assault on Gaza, over 500 medical workers had been killed in the Strip. That figure now stands at over 1,000. And yet, doctors, nurses, paramedics, and medical support staff continue to do their work. Some of the most affecting parts of the MSF report involve the eyewitness testimony of MSF medical staff. trying to save Palestinian lives without proper equipment or medicines. Now, this is quite a long piece of testimony, but I think it captures every aspect of the chaos that Israel has imposed on Gaza's hospital, all while filling them with Palestinians brutally injured by bombs and bullets. Javid Abdelmoneim, head of the MSF medical team in Gaza, gave this account. The hospital quickly became chaotic. A 3-year-old child was injured. Her parents were worried because she was looking straight at me. I thought she was fine because she was breathing, but when I removed her dressing, you could see the bone in her left thigh. Seconds later, the doors opened with a bang. 4 or 5 injured people came in, some of them first aiders. Among the injured was a boy who wasn't breathing. We tried to resuscitate him when the nurse looked at us and asked why we were looking after him when we could be saving other lives. No one had the courage to declare him dead and move on to the next person. He was someone's child. But we had to move on to the next one, then another, and this went on for 4.5 hours. In the emergency room, blood was all over the floor, and I had to kneel down to see the patients on the floor. They were spread out all over the place. There were no beds left. I could feel my knees getting wet with blood. At the same time, more and more patients were arriving. I've worked in similar situations with max influxes of injured people all over the world, and the smell of blood is the same wherever you are. But here in Gaza, the horror really hit home. In the middle of our work, we saw our colleague, an MSF anaesthetist, in the emergency room. I asked him what he was doing there and why he wasn't in the operating theatre. I've just heard that my house has been destroyed and my daughter and nephew are here somewhere, he replied. Later, we learned that his nephew had been killed. Helena, I mean, there's almost nothing left to say at this point, but how do you respond to that report from Médecins Sans Frontières?
Well, it's just another chapter we can add in the history of, quote unquote, the most moral army in the world, isn't it? I mean, it seems surreal looking and seeing the reports that have come out of MSF.
You guys at Dropsite have a really interesting report about Hamas documents provided by Israel to the New York Times, and all of this goes to Iran as well, which is that's the central fear of Americans here. It's the World War III component, and now you have the New York Times. This is a great story. You should just
really fascinating and embarrassing for the New York Times story in Dropsite by Jeremy Scahill and Sharif Abdelkadouz. We can put this up on the screen. We can put a link in there. But so basically, to give the gist of what's going on here, so twice now in the last couple months, the New York Times has run major bombshell stories citing Hamas documents that were found by Israel and then given to the New York Times. So that's the chain of custody, alleged chain of custody of these documents. So when you're doing this reporting, what you need to do is figure out whether or not the documents that you're being given are authentic. One of the ways you can do that is by verifying that the source of the documents would have access to those documents and doesn't have a motivation to lie about them. So in other words, if a Hamas whistleblower, for instance, or an IDF whistleblower reaches out and you can confirm that that is who they are, and they hand over some documents to you, you start out with a threshold of, okay, these are probably authentic, but I'm going to need to cross-reference some things. I'm going to need to figure some other things out. Now, if Hamas came to you and said that they had discovered some IDF documents and then gave you those documents, you start from a place of skepticism.
Yes.
Because they are motivated to lie about them, and they wouldn't really have access to them. They say, well, it was during October 7th, we were in we were in one of the military bases and we made off with some hard drives, and here are the documents that we got. What you would then do is you would take those documents and you would give them to sources connected to the IDF, presumably former, because if you give them current, then it's, they're not going to be able to do that unless they're quite trustworthy. And that those sources will then try to figure out, okay, here are some problems with these documents, or say, these actually kind of look authentic. There's other things you can do to try to authenticate them. So,
right.
New York Times gets these documents from Hamas, allegedly from Hamas through Israel. And so they take it to a former Hamas guy. They take it to Salah al-Awada. That's who they name in their article as saying that they bear resemblance to Hamas documents and that these are good enough. You should go ahead and publish these documents. That's who the Times cites. So Jeremy Scahill calls the guy up and says, what else can you tell me about these documents? This sounds very interesting. And you can read the full story. He tells him, I didn't tell the New York Times these were authentic documents. And I'll just read one portion of it. Al-Awade told Dropsite that the Times only shared one page out of 30 with him. After looking it over, he said he told the Times reporter that there was a particular phrase in the document that he suspected was a translation and that the person who wrote it did not sound native in Arabic. I told him, this looks translated, it doesn't look real. This phrase is out of context, it is not used, and its meaning is not clear. The phrase in question roughly translates in English as, quote, air cover, quote, I told him it might be translated from another language, that whomever wrote it translated it literally, but it is not used in the modern Arabic context, unquote. And he also shared a voice note with Dropsite that he had sent to the reporter where he had raised these doubts, and he also shared, the exchanges that they'd had. So we know that this conversation happened because the Times says it happened. Like the Times says they talked to this guy. And he shared with us what he told them. So think about that. So now imagine that you are a reporter. Hamas has handed you documents that they say are Hebrew documents from the IDF.
Yeah.
You show it to a Hebrew speaker, and the Hebrew speaker tells you, and Hebrew speaker who used to be with the IDF, Hebrew speaker says, this word actually looks like it was originally written in Arabic and translated into Hebrew. This doesn't look right. You could not then source that person as authenticating your documents. What that person told you is that you have fake documents. And how pathetic is it that Israel, which is in the Middle East, doesn't have Arabic speakers to fabricate their documents?
It's like not even a good fabrication.
Like they're using Google Translate? Like they're starting in Hebrew or English and then just having it translated into Arabic? And what happens when you do that is that your language doesn't sound authentic. And so that particular story was a claim, you remember this bombshell, was a claim that Iran was read in on October 7th.
Right.
And that Hamas wanted Iranian help for October 7th.
Which is a hugely significant.
And which was used as a pretext
argument,
for the expansion of their assault on Iran.
Yeah.
So it turns out that's just completely fake. So now, fast forward to just a couple days ago, they put out a new investigation that they said was from Hamas documents that Israel had obtained and given to the New York Times. This one, the document said, basically, it was Hamas saying, we love to hide our militants inside UNRWA schools. And UNRWA is our secret weapon to go after Israel. Like, that's basically what they're saying this document says. In that article, they say that they were not able to authenticate the documents, but they believed they were authentic because they bore similarities to previous documents that they had been able to authenticate. So they're clearly referring back to these Iran documents, which we now know were fabricated themselves. So Israel is just concocting, and then what did they do? Bombed in 2 UNRWA schools and killed more than 60 people. So like this is all premeditated. So they cook up these fake documents, they give them to the New York Times, they say these are Hamas documents, and then they use that article as pretext then for some slaughter that they carry out. They did get busted by Bild, not by Bild. Bild, and I believe it was Jewish Currents, ran a piece based on quote-unquote Hamas documents that said that Yahya Sinwar was planning to escape to Egypt with a bunch of hostages. That turned out to be demonstrably proven to be a hoax. And a bunch of egg on Bild's face. And that's not in question. You don't need to take it from me that was fake. But that happened before the New York Times getting hoaxed here.
So the reason, there are many reasons, but one of the pieces of this puzzle that's so significant is obviously the Iran link, because the New York Times, in 2002, 2003, was relying on bad sourcing, and that reporting was used over and over again to substantiate war.
Right,
It's a lesson that has very recently been learned, specifically by the New York Times. And some of this, you and I probably disagree on some of this, but some of it doesn't even need to be faked and exaggerated, because we've talked before about how there's a genuine challenge for UNRWA in Gaza to disentangle itself from the government, which is de facto Hamas. Right. Like this.
Right. They have tens of thousands of employees.
Right. Yeah. And it just, so all that is to say, for the New York Times, I mean, Israel's another question, but for the New York Times.
And to the point, like most of those tens of thousands of employees are like teachers and those types of folks. So do some of them work, on the side for Hamas? Yeah, like a handful, like no doubt.
Yeah, it's a problem.
But what Israel had claimed that they had found, much more sinister collaboration, and then used that to slaughter a bunch of civilians who were sheltering in these schools.
It's very, very sloppy. I mean, on the part of the New York Times, and such a high stakes.
Yeah, and I don't even know why. I don't even know why Israel and the New York Times bother at this point. Israel has shown that it can slaughter endless amounts of Palestinians without any cover. They don't even need the New York Times to lie for them. So if you're at the New York Times, you can stand down. Like, the world has given up. The world is just allowing this genocide to unfold. You want to go ahead and burn your credibility in order to facilitate more of the genocide? You go ahead and do it, but you don't actually have to anymore. Like, nobody's going to stop them.
It's this Jeremy just calling the guy up.
Hey.
It's just like
he's like, oh, can you prove that? Yeah, here's a voice memo, here's texts.
It's such a sad statement.
It's so embarrassing. So we went to the New York Times for comment, and they responded by saying that they didn't answer any of the questions directly. They responded by saying it was a rich story based on lots of different sources.
Sure.
So they talked to analysts and other people for other parts of the story. The headline, the lead, and the whole story are about these documents that you obtained. And you're not even going to stand up for those documents.
Right, exactly. That's a cop-out, 100%.
Pathetic. They should be ashamed of themselves. They feel like they have total impunity because the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, all these other outlets that used to be major competitors of theirs have all withered. And so the New York Times now just stands alone. And so they're just completely unchecked, except by people within their newsroom and by independent media at this point. But the editors, will they even hold a meeting about this? Oh, hey, by the way, guys, we turns out we got hoaxed and ran two major stories based on documents that were fabricated, and dozens of people were killed. Many of them were burned to death as a result of, and on the predicate of these articles that we published and got hoaxed. Should we meet about this and try to not have this happen again? Because even if you don't care about all the death, it's embarrassing. But because they have so much impunity, because they have no competitors at this point.
That's a really interesting point. Because
they're not even going to have a meeting about this.
In prior eras, the Washington Post would have loved to have run your drop site
story. Light them up.
And they would have been calling the source.
Yeah.
If they had more, if they had more resources, and absolutely. More right now they're really just not even competing with the Times. So it's not necessarily even a thought like, oh, let's spend some of our reporters' time calling up one of their sources. But
yeah, and there's also a kind of colonialism where it's like, you can actually just say whatever you want about Hamas and Hamas documents. Just say it, and nobody's going to raise an issue with it.
We're moving on to this next story again. I want you to think about words or action. What matters more? Going into this story here with Candace Owens. Now, Candace Owens and I don't agree on a lot politically. We do agree on Israel politically. And there is something that she said recently. There's a clip going viral on Twitter. I want to take you to the full part of that conversation, not just those 2 minutes on Twitter. What she said here to Piers Morgan about what Israel is doing, the vocabulary that she used is incredibly important when you are pressed with this statement. Well, how can it be a genocide? It's only 50,000 people. So one, I would argue and push back. The numbers are underreported purposefully. If you do the math, and Ralph Nader has done this, the math with the number of bombs that have been dropped and the density of Gaza, it's got to be at least about 200,000 people by now. So there's that. But when you say that, they're going to say, oh, well, you don't know that for sure. This is the number. This is the data. This is the number that's reported. So this is what we're going to go by. So the point that I'm making is that the pro-Israel side, and in this case, Piers Morgan, he is using that as a way to say it's not a genocide. But Candace said something that is incredibly important that I want all of us to start to echo. You ain't got to agree with Candace on everything, but she's right on this. First and foremost, she starts discussing, I don't know if you guys know this, but apparently she was awarded Anti-Semite of the Year. I mean, people come up with all kind of stuff, right? Anti-Semite of the Year, some award. But that isn't stopping her from talking about this issue. She's still talking about it. And a number of people probably would have backed away. So just keep that in mind. Listen to this.
I don't view Jewish people to be some exception where you're allowed to now call everybody anti-Semites because you can't actually debate what Bibi Netanyahu is doing and why so many people around the world are not comfortable with it. So yes, they can award that all they want. People are mocking it. It's now become like cartoonish. And they have, unfortunately or fortunately, completely removed the power from that term.
What is your view of Jewish people, of Judaism?
Yeah.
For the record, what's your view?
My view is that Judaism is a faith. Israel is a state, and it is not above critique. And that what Bibi Netanyahu has done to the Palestinians since October 7th is a Holocaust. It is a Holocaust that is being committed on Palestinian children and women. And I'm not going to quiet my perspective on that, to kowtow to whatever the prevailing narrative is at the New York Post.
So notice how she said she's not going to, and this is another thing about her not being attached to the Daily Wire anymore, which I think is better for her. It's because now she doesn't have to worry about, well, do I have to still walk this line because of Ben and all the rest of them at the Daily Wire who were critical of her criticism of Israel. She doesn't have to worry about that anymore. And don't get me wrong, people are still going to criticize her, but she's not working with the people directly who are criticizing her. But even though she got that Anti-Semite of the Year, the award, whatever, like I said, it's just weird the stuff people come up with now. Even though she got that award, that was done in an attempt to silence her, but she's not being silent. Right after she got that award, she went on to do this interview and she goes pretty in depth about what is happening and what Israel is doing. So you guys got to understand, sometimes these tactics that are used, it's in an effort to silence you. When you see a lot of these smear campaigns against people, sometimes there may be some truth to it, but from what I've seen, particularly in this space, a lot of times it's bullshit. The smear tactics that are done towards like the gray zone, the smear tactics that have happened towards like even those of us that are saying, leave the Democratic Party, they'll smear us as right wing or whatever, because they have nothing else, right? So these things are done to discredit that person and to stop them from spreading the message that they're spreading. And I don't agree with every message that Candace Owens has decided to spread. I mean, she said so herself later on Twitter that not only was it, acceptable when she was at the Daily Wire, but it was encouraged for her to go after the Black community. So just keep that in mind. So I don't agree with every message that she tried to spread, but this one in particular, I do appreciate the fact that she is still continuing to discuss it and not back down, even though she received that award, because that was a tactic. When they banned her from Australia, that was a tactic, another one to try to silence you. These are things that will happen, right?
The larger discussion that's happening right now is whether or not having survived a Holocaust gives you the permission to commit a Holocaust. And for whatever reason, people have been, what I would say, milking the Holocaust narrative in the same way that Black Americans were milking the slavery narrative, and essentially saying, like, we lived through this and we survived this. And so now nobody can say that anything we do is wrong. And that's the big issue today, is that we have so many people that will not recognize that it is totally feasible that a Jewish person, and I'm speaking here about Bibi Netanyahu, could do something as horrific as what was done to the Jews throughout World War II or throughout history.
Pause here for a second. I just want to echo, say something here. I actually have never heard Black people say that you can't criticize us because of slavery. I've never heard that. So I don't know where Candace heard that from, but I've never heard that.
An accurate comparison. I'll tell you why I say that. As we know, I mean, whatever Dan Bilzerian wants people to believe, 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Another 6 million people were murdered by Hitler and the Nazis. The numbers of people being killed in Gaza are, in my view, have gone way beyond what is acceptable as a response to October the 7th. However, you're still talking about, at the moment, a death toll of under 50,000. There's no comparison in the amount of dead people compared to the Holocaust. So do you understand why?
But it is a Holocaust.
Pause. Does everybody see what Pierce is doing? This is why I'm telling you, they keep holding on to the number that has been reported. Because as long as they can say, well, it's only been 50,000 people, they can follow that with, well, it's not actually a genocide based on the numbers. This is why they keep holding on to that number. And I think we've talked about this before on the show where, you know, the Palestinian, like the Ministry of Health, that they underreport on purpose because they don't want to overreport and then find out, oh, it's not da-da-da. So they actually underreport. But if you do the math, like Ralph Nader apparently did, with the number of bombs that have been dropped, the density of the area, and the starvation, don't forget, the starvation is still happening. The numbers are more than 50,000. There's no way. It's basic math when you do it, right? So he's holding on to that number. Listen to this.
What's happening?
Well, is it though?
Yes.
So, I think language is really important.
I think language is really important as well. And that's
people
why
say Holocaust, genocide,
I think what's happening is a Holocaust. The burning bodies of the children that I'm seeing every day, and we spoke about this a little bit on my show, but I have recognized that the ability to see this stuff every day has transformed my opinion. Maybe the numbers wouldn't have gotten so high if people had spoken up when it was happening at the very beginning during World War II. And so I want to use my platform to say that I believe that they are intentionally executing a Holocaust. I think Bibi Netanyahu, there's tons of evidence, and obviously the Western media is not reporting on this, but the corruption trials that are going on with Bibi Netanyahu pertaining to October 7th and him editing the transcripts and the prior knowledge that he knew is now becoming extremely pertinent. It is a question as to whether or not he allowed the attacks to take place, essentially to then be able to go in and to commit this Holocaust against the Palestinians. Now, based on everything that I've looked into and stuff that I had not seen before, because the Western media doesn't cover it, Bibi Netanyahu caught off camera speaking about how he had no intention of following the Abraham Accords and how he was going to get around it. He has, I believe, genocidal ambitions, and that's enough. We don't need to dispute, go backward or forward. Do I think Bibi Netanyahu has genocidal ambitions against the Palestinians? The answer is yes.
Yes.
Do you think he's a war criminal?
Yes. I believe he's a war criminal. And I think that the issue is how much power he has, particularly in America. And I want to make sure that I'm just crossing or I guess making that clear to people across the pond. You know, in America, we have lobbying. You guys don't have lobbying here. And so this is why it might seem...
We do, but not to the same degree.
Yes, like AIPAC spent $100 million in our elections. And what that means is that they're able to write fellowships, they're able to pay journalists, they're able to pay people to attack and take down people who speak against their initiatives. And they are, AIPAC, I would say, is very much pro-Likud party, pro-Bibi Netanyahu. And this is why you have seen people like me being attacked in the way that they have been attacked for what I believe is just a human stance on what's happening to the Palestinians. I don't care where if you had flipped it, if it had not been Israelis, if it had been, if it had been Christians doing this to Muslims, I would say the exact same thing based on the images that I've seen. But there is a ton of evidence that Bibi Netanyahu allowed October 7th to take place, including the things that we found out, because I now read Haaretz daily to
You don't actually think he knew it was going to happen?
Well, let's just talk about the facts. We don't have to speculate on that.
So Israel gives away their own game, because when they tell you that they know that they're hiding in tunnels, but they're not going into the tunnels, you already know what the game is. Anybody else still defending what Israel is doing at this point is either naive, foolish, or they're in on it. They support what Israel is doing. And the US government does support that. Now, they're not going to come out and tell you that. Biden's not going to come out and tell you that. Hell, Kamala's not going to tell you that. None of them are going to tell you that, because that would make them look pretty bad, right? No, they're not going to say that, but they do. If they didn't support what Israel was doing, they would stop giving them weapons just like that. They could also stop giving them weapons because they're starving people in Gaza still. They're still starving them. You can watch videos, you can Google and see videos from nurses and doctors that are in Gaza that are repeatedly doing these interviews on corporate media telling people they're not allowing the food and the supplies to get in. That's not coming from Palestinians. That's coming from American doctors who are over there. So this is the thing. Their goal was not to take out Hamas. I said this over and over again. They were never really trying to find Hamas. They were trying to level Gaza all together. And the sooner people understand that, the sooner they can stop asking this question about why is it that we haven't had a ceasefire yet? We haven't had a ceasefire because the US government doesn't really want them to have a ceasefire. The only reason they even started saying ceasefire is because of all the pressure from the protesters. They didn't expect that to happen. That's the only reason. That was just to calm us down. So just keep that in mind.
So the idea that they had to level the entire place plus go out into refugee camps doesn't make any sense. Like I said, I think their goal, and as they do, they have all these policies mowing the lawn, where they kill a certain amount of Palestinians every year. This is genocidal. The aims here are genocidal.
Your father-in-law, very highly well-regarded man in this country, Lord Michael Fahmy, said the Israeli Defense Forces were acting in a highly accountable way in an extremely complex and difficult environment. We cannot forget that they have been forced to prosecute this war. Obviously, a different interpretation of events there. Have you discussed this with him?
Yeah, I mean, I try to separate my politics from his politics because I think it's unfair in any family to say, well, what does your mom think? What does your cousin think? What does my sister think? My sister's a Democrat, What I can say is I deeply respect him. He's done a tremendous amount of work. And I want to say this. I was on the Zionist side. Let's not forget this. For years, I worked for Prager University. I worked for Daily Wire. And so I was much more sympathetic to, I would say, the Zionist cause throughout my entire career. But the difference is, and I think we spoke about this on my podcast, generationally, with the access of social media, being able to see these things every day versus the person who, as you described it, as you are still, because you're kind of a combo, who hears the thud of the newspaper and reads the newspaper and believes that, or, this kind of becomes or colors their worldview, is very different. Social media completely transformed my perspective on what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And I'm disgusted with myself for not being more awake.
Okay, but that's
to
interesting because...
Pause that for a second. Something I want to add here as well. Many of us that grew up in the church, we were taught these things too. And if you're watching and you're like me, and people are like, oh, not in the black church. No, we were taught that in the black church too. If you're like me and you grew up in the church, you were taught this too. That not that they were supposed to go and kill all these Palestinian people, but you were taught that Israel was the Holy Land and that was supposed to be for the Jewish people. And then you learn about, in Revelations and all that stuff. Like it's really having flashbacks here. We were taught that. We were taught that that was supposed to be their sacred place. Now, I was really young back then. The last time I remember asking questions about something that was interpreted by our pastor at that time from the Bible, I got some really strange looks. and I was just a teenager, and I had a question. And I learned very quickly there were just certain questions, like you weren't supposed to question it. You weren't supposed to question not just the biblical text, but you damn sure as hell weren't supposed to question the preacher who was interpreting the biblical text, not keeping in mind that different people have different interpretations of the Bible. There's also different versions of the Bible as well. Some people follow the Old Testament. Some people follow the New Testament. Some people kind of look at both. I mean, there's so many different. And so you were taught pretty early on that this is how it was supposed to be. So when people ask the questions, well, why do Christians support what's happening? Because that's what we were taught in the church, right? I had to do my own research, guys. I didn't know when I was growing up in the church, I didn't know these things were happening to the Palestinian people. I didn't know anything about this stuff. I learned more as I got older. And a journalist named Abby Martin made one hell of a documentary. And that really opened my eyes. And I started to pay more attention, and I started to read more and more about it. So if people don't educate you about the issue, you can go your whole life believing this is right. It's just something to think about. We'll go on a little bit more here, and then I want to show you something else.
Nobody is going
But I
to
think
side.
that works. I think that works in almost every single debate in the world right now. I see it the other way around, where you get being accused of being an Islamophobe if you dare to criticize anything on the Palestinian side, even if a lot of the stuff that's been going on is worthy of criticism.
I haven't seen that, and I say this as someone who was deeply critical of people that were Islamic throughout my entire career, because again, I jumped into politics, and there's a certain perspective that you're supposed to have in America about Zionism, and you're supposed to kind of marry yourself to it. And despite all of the things that I now kind of blush when I look back on, that I sort of had those factory settings, they never kind of just like routinely dismissed me. They just kind of were like, well, she's bought and paid for, never called me an Islamophobe, whatever it is. I just want to be fair. And I want to be fair. If something happened tomorrow and in an elite place in America and a bunch of Jews were killed and targeted, I want to stand on my platform and say what is happening to Jewish people is wrong. I'm not married to hating Jews, because I think what Bibi Netanyahu is wrong. Is doing is wrong. It has nothing to do with the Jewish people at large. This is a foreign state. Yep. He's allowed to be criticized in the same way that I criticize Biden, in the same way that you can criticize Trump. I'm criticizing Bibi Netanyahu, and I think the ICC got it correct in pursuing an arrest against him.
And she's right. And so I want to go ahead and stop that right there. And I want to show you why it was really important that she mentioned the word intent. What are his intentions? I think that's something that we need to hold on to, that word right there. And I want to show you why. Because people keep going back to the number, and they're not looking at what the UN defines as a genocide. The United Nations defines genocide. And I want you to see the definition of the word genocide. This is the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Article 2. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part of national, ethical, racial, or religious group. Let's just stop right there for a second and look at what it says. This is the word, ladies and gentlemen. It's that word intent. When Piers Morgan says, how can it be a genocide if there's only been like 50,000 people that have been killed? And I told you, I don't believe that number. I think it's more people. There's more bodies that are buried under the rubble, and it's probably closer to like 200,000 people at this point in time. But I digress. The number at this point isn't as relevant as Piers Morgan thinks it is. And a lot of people who are supporting Israel are holding on to that number. But the reality is, if you look at the UN definition of genocide, it involves the word with the intent. So the point that Candace was trying to make is that Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party have been very vocal about their intention to flatten Gaza, to take the land, to get rid of the Palestinian people. This is not a secret. It's not like it's hush hush behind some closed door. These are statements they have made publicly. They called them all Amalek. Don't forget about that. They've been very vocal about taking the Gaza beachfront property and building it up as some type of resort area. Leave Gaza aside for a second. Go to the West Bank. Removing the Palestinian people from their homes, taking their homes. So it's not secret. So the next time that someone comes to you and they say, well, it's not a genocide because the numbers are blah, 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 instead of pushing back and saying, well, actually, if you do the math, the real numbers are blah, 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 because they're just going to come back to you with another, well, you don't know that because that's not what the data says. Show them the definition on the UN's website. Show them what it says. It is that key word, intent. Killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in parts. Notice it says, or in parts. So a genocide doesn't mean all the people. It can even be just in parts. Imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So the first two right here, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, they even include mental, deliberately inflicting on the group's conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole and part. The first three all apply. Just the first three alone. Starvation, destruction. I mean, come on. And the intent. And that's what you need to remember. We can put the link to this in the chat for people, so you have that as a reference to go back to. Because when it comes to Israel, when we talk about words or actions, for Israel, it's both. Because their actions show you that they're trying to kill all the Palestinian people and they want the land. But they also have the words to back it up, because their words show their intentions.